May 12, 1945. The clock tower of Heidelberg strikes 7 in the morning. The cobblestones are still damp with spring dew as Greta Müller pulls her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. She has walked this same route to the baker's shop every morning for 23 years, past the same timber-framed houses, beneath the same red-tiled roofs that have sheltered her neighbors since before the Great War. But this morning, something stops her in her tracks at the corner of Hauptstrasse. Above die Teeth, the Steinbach family home, where young Wilhelm once played violin before he marched east with the Wehrmacht. A foreign banner snaps in the morning breeze. Red, white, and blue stripes. 13 stars arranged in a perfect rectangle against a field of blue. The American flag. Greta's weathered hands tremble as she grips her empty shopping basket. The sight hits her like a physical blow. Not of violence, but of profound, incomprehensible change. In all her 52 years, through 2 wars and countless hardships, she has never seen a foreign flag flying over a German home. Not the French tricolor, not the British Union Jack, and certainly not this symbol of a nation that, until now, existed only in her imagination as a place of cowboys and movie stars. The spring of 1945 marked the end of the Third Reich, but for millions of German civilians, it marked the beginning of a transformation that would shake the very foundations of their understanding of the world. As American forces swept across Western Germany, they didn't merely occupy territory. They requisitioned entire neighborhoods, transforming private German homes into temporary American outposts. And with each requisition came a ritual that would etch itself into the collective memory of a defeated nation. The raising of the EFE, stars and stripes over German domestic life. What these German women witnessed in those first weeks of occupation challenged everything they had been told about their enemies, about their own nation's strength, and about the nature of abundance itself. They had prepared for conquest, but they had not prepared for prosperity. They had braced for brutality, but they had not anticipated the bewildering generosity of chocolate bars and cigarettes freely given to their children. For 12 years, German propaganda had painted Americans as weak, materialistic, and racially inferior. The Völkischer Beobachter had mocked American industrial capacity, dismissing it as the product of Jewish manipulation and mongrel labor. German women had been told that American soldiers were poorly trained, cowardly, and equipped with inferior weapons. When the bombers came, Nazi officials explained them away as desperate acts by a failing enemy. When the Atlantic Wall crumbled, they called it a strategic withdrawal. But when Greta Müller and thousands like her saw that flag snapping in the wind above their neighbor's house, they confronted a reality that shattered every assumption they had been fed. This was not the banner of a weak nation. This was not the symbol of a people on the verge of collapse. This was the flag of abundance, carried by young men who distributed Hershey bars like they were common stones, who smoked cigarettes as if tobacco grew in their backyard gardens, who wore uniforms so well made that German tailors would have wept with envy. The requisition process itself was a study in contrasts that German civilians struggled to comprehend. Lieutenant Charles, Marshal of the 3rd Armored Division, would later recall how his unit would simply march into a German village and inform the Burgermeister that they required the finest homes for their officers. Within hours, German families would be gathering their most precious possessions, clearing out bedrooms that had housed their children, emptying parlors where 3 generations had celebrated Christmas mornings. But what struck the displaced German families was not the loss of their homes. They had expected that. What stunned them was the manner of the occupation. American soldiers didn't just take over German houses. They transformed them. Out came portable radios playing jazz music that German ears had never heard. Up went photographs of American sweethearts and baseball teams. In the kitchens, soldiers opened K-rations containing beef stew, chocolate bars, cigarettes, and coffee. More luxury goods than many German families had seen in years. Margaret Fischer, a widow from Würzburg, would later write in her diary, They moved into the Hoffman house yesterday. I watched from my window as they carried in boxes and boxes of supplies. Herr Hoffman never had so much food in his cellar, not even before the war. And then they raised their flag. I had to sit down. It was beautiful, in a way that frightened me. So clean, so new, so confident. The flag itself became a symbol that transcended its political meaning. For German women who had spent 4 years mending and remending the same dresses, darning the same stockings, stretching every ration to feed their families, the pristine condition of these American flags spoke of resources beyond their comprehension. The fabric was new, not recycled. The colors were bright, not faded from years of wartime shortages. The stars and stripes didn't just represent American political power. They represented American abundance. And abundance, as German civilians quickly discovered, was America's most devastating weapon. Martha Weber, a schoolteacher from Frankfurt, watched from behind her lace curtains as American soldiers established themselves in the villa across the street. She expected looting, perhaps violence. Instead, she witnessed something that challenged her understanding of warfare itself. The soldiers didn't steal the German family's belongings. They simply moved them aside to make room for their own superior equipment. They didn't destroy the beautiful garden. They set up their field kitchen next to the rose bushes and shared their canned peaches with German children who pressed their faces against the garden fence. I thought they would hate us. Martha would tell her sister in a letter that somehow survived the chaos of 1945. But they acted like they had already forgotten we were enemies. They were laughing, playing their music, sharing their food with our children. And that flag, it didn't look like a conqueror's banner. It looked like a neighbor's welcome mat. The psychological impact of witnessing American abundance was magnified by the context of German deprivation. By the spring of 1945, even middle-class German families had been reduced to survival rations. Ersatz coffee made from roasted grain, bread stretched with sawdust, children who remembered the taste of real chocolate only in dreams. The German war economy had stripped the nation bare, channeling every resource toward military production, while civilian populations made do with substitutes and hope. Into this world of scarcity marched American soldiers carrying more in their individual K-rations than most German families saw in a week. Each American infantryman's standard kit included cigarettes that were worth a month's wages on the German black market, chocolate bars that German children hadn't tasted in years, and chewing gum, a luxury so exotic that many German adults had never experienced it. Ingrid Kellner, a mother of 3 from Munich, watched American soldiers requisition her neighbor's house and set up what appeared to be a small store of goods on the front porch. They were trading cigarettes for photographs, chocolate for information about the local area, she remembered decades later. But they weren't desperate traders. They were generous, almost careless with things that we considered precious. One soldier gave my youngest daughter an entire chocolate bar just for smiling at him. An entire bar! She had never held so much chocolate in her life. The flag flying over the requisitioned house became a daily reminder of this new reality. Every morning, as Ingrid walked to the communal well for water, she would glance up at those stars and stripes and feel a mixture of emotions she couldn't name. Resentment at the occupation, amazement at American wealth, fear about the future, but also, and this was the part that troubled her most, a growing sense of curiosity about the nation that could wage war with such material abundance that its soldiers treated luxuries like everyday items. The transformation of German neighborhoods under American occupation created a unique form of psychological warfare that no military planner had anticipated. The sight of American flags flying over German homes wasn't just a symbol of military conquest, it was a daily advertisement for a different way of life. These weren't the threadbare banners of an army fighting for survival. These were the fresh, bright symbols of a nation so wealthy that it could afford to ship new flags across an ocean to to mark temporary housing for junior officers. Liesel Brenner, who lost her husband at Stalingrad and her eldest son in the Battle of the Bulge, found herself drawn to watch the daily routine at the requisitioned house next door. They raised the flag every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, she recalled, not because they had to. There was no German authority left to impress. They did it because it was their custom, their way of marking their space. And watching them, I began to understand that this was not an army of conquerors trying to prove their dominance. This was an army of young men who carried their home with them, who planted their familiar symbols wherever they went, because abundance was so natural to them that they couldn't imagine being anywhere without it. The daily flag ceremony became a neighborhood event, though none of the German observers would have admitted it. Children who should have been in school pressed their faces against windows to watch. Elderly men found excuses to tend their gardens just as the Americans began their morning routine. German women discovered sudden needs to sweep their front steps or hang laundry on lines that provided the perfect vantage point for observation. What they witnessed challenged their most fundamental assumptions about their former enemies. These American soldiers weren't the racial inferiors described in Der Stürmer. They weren't the bumbling amateurs portrayed in Wehrmacht intelligence reports. They were young men who moved with confident efficiency, who maintained their equipment to standards that impressed even German engineering sensibilities, who treated their flag ceremony with a respect that spoke of genuine patriotism rather than enforced obedience. The chocolate bar became the recurring symbol that would define this transformation. Unlike weapons or uniforms, chocolate transcended military significance. It was pure abundance, sweetness with no strategic purpose, luxury wrapped in silver foil and distributed with casual generosity. German children who approached American positions weren't offered propaganda leaflets or military rations. They were given Hershey bars, their first taste of industrial-scale confectionery. Klaus Weber, then 7 years old, would never forget the day an American sergeant teaching him to say "okay" in English handed him not 1, but 3 chocolate bars. "Take them home to your mother and sister," the sergeant said in broken German, using hand gestures to make his meaning clear. Klaus ran home clutching the chocolate bars like precious artifacts, bursting through the door to show his mother treasures that represented more sweetness than their family had possessed in 2 years. His mother, Anna Weber, stared at the chocolate bars with emotions she couldn't untangle. Relief that her son was safe, amazement at American generosity, but also a profound sense of displacement. If America could afford to give away chocolate bars to the children of their enemies, what did that say about the war they had just lost? What did it say about the claims of German superiority that had sustained them through 6 years of conflict? "I held those chocolate bars in my hands," Anna would tell her grandchildren decades later, "and I realized that everything we had been told was a lie. Not just about Americans, but about ourselves. We had been told we were the master race, but the master race doesn't lose wars to people they consider inferior. We had been told that Germany was the strongest nation in Europe, but strong nations don't get defeated by armies that can afford to give away chocolate to enemy children." The American flag flying over the requisitioned house became a daily reminder of this new reality. Each morning, as Anna watched the flag ceremony from her kitchen window, she felt herself changing. The anger was still there. Anger at losing the war, at losing her husband, at seeing foreign soldiers in German streets. But alongside the anger grew something else, a recognition that the world was more complex than Nazi ideology had allowed her to believe. The abundance that American soldiers displayed wasn't just material, it was philosophical. They carried themselves like men who had never doubted that their cause was just, who had never questioned whether they deserved the good things in life. They shared their cigarettes and chocolate, not because they were trying to win German hearts and minds, but because sharing was natural to them. They raised their flag each morning not to intimidate German civilians, but because the ritual connected them to a home that existed in abundance so profound that it could be exported across oceans. Elizabeth Hoffman, whose house was requisitioned by American officers, was allowed to remain in her basement apartment while the upper floors housed American personnel. For 3 months, she lived directly beneath the enemy, listening to their conversations, their music, their laughter. They weren't monsters, she wrote in a letter to her sister that survived the occupation. They were boys, really. Boys who missed their mothers, who worried about girlfriends back home, who played cards and listened to music and wrote letters. But they were boys from a place where being young was still possible, where the future was still bright. The psychological transformation that German women experienced watching American flags fly over their neighborhoods was profound and irreversible. They had prepared for military occupation, the displacement, the restrictions, the loss of sovereignty. They had not prepared for cultural occupation, for the daily confrontation with a way of life that made their own deprivations seem not just temporary but somehow chosen. Flag ceremony became a mirror in which German civilians saw themselves and reflected through American eyes. When they watched American soldiers raise the stars and stripes with genuine reverence, they were forced to confront uncomfortable questions about their own relationship with German symbols. Had they ever felt the same authentic patriotism for the swastika? Or had their support for Nazi symbols been based on fear, conformity, and propaganda rather than genuine belief? Maria Lindemann, a seamstress from Cologne, found herself studying the American flag with professional interest. The stitching was machine-perfect, she noted in her diary. The colors were fast-dyed, the fabric was quality wool. Even their flag was made with abundance in mind, built to last, built to be proud of. Our flags toward the end were made of whatever scraps we could find, dyed with whatever colors were available. Looking at their flag, I realized we had been impoverished in ways I hadn't even recognized. The abundance extended beyond material goods to encompass attitude and expectation. American soldiers carried themselves like men who expected good things to happen, who assumed that problems could be solved, that the future would be better than the past. This optimism was perhaps more foreign to German civilians than the flag itself. 6 years of war, 12 years of totalitarian rule, and a generation of economic instability had taught Germans to expect hardship, to prepare for scarcity, to find strength in endurance rather than hope. But watching American soldiers go about their daily routines under the American flag, German women glimpsed a different relationship with the future. These young men weren't just surviving, they were planning. They talked about going home to jobs and marriages and college educations. They assumed that America would still be there, still be prosperous, still be free when they returned. They carried their abundance not just in their supplies, but in their expectations. The chocolate bar emerged as the perfect symbol of this abundance because it represented pure surplus, sweetness beyond necessity, pleasure beyond survival. When American soldiers distributed chocolate to German children, they weren't sharing their rations. They were sharing their certainty that there would always be more chocolate where that came from. Gertrude Schwartz, a widow who watched American soldiers distribute candy to children in her neighborhood, later wrote, "I realized that for them, chocolate wasn't precious because it was rare. It was precious because sweetness itself was precious, because making children happy was important enough to carry chocolate across an ocean and through a war." They weren't giving away their last chocolate bar. They were giving away one of many, confident that abundance was their natural state. The daily confrontation with American abundance began to reshape German women's understanding of defeat itself. Military loss they could comprehend. Armies could be outmaneuvered, weapons could malfunction, strategic decisions could prove wrong. But the defeat they witnessed under the American flag wasn't just military, it was philosophical. They had lost a war to a nation that could afford to be generous to its enemies, that carried its prosperity so lightly that sharing it required no sacrifice. This realization was both humbling and liberating. Humbling because it revealed the extent to which German confidence had been built on propaganda rather than reality. Liberating because it suggested that the world beyond Germany was not the hostile, impoverished place Nazi ideology had described, but rather a realm of possibilities that German civilians were only beginning to imagine. As weeks passed, and the American flag continued to fly over requisitioned German homes, something fundamental shifted in the consciousness of German women who witnessed this daily symbol of occupation. The flag stopped representing conquest and began representing possibility. Not the possibility of American military power, that was already established, but the possibility of a different relationship with abundance, with optimism, with the future itself. The transformation was subtle but profound. German women who had spent years making do, stretching resources, finding ways to survive scarcity, began to glimpse a world where abundance was the starting point rather than the distant goal. They saw in the American flag not just a symbol of military victory, but a banner representing a nation where chocolate was common, where flags could be new rather than mended, where young men could carry their home with them, because home was abundant enough to be portable. When Germany finally surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, the American flags flying over German homes took on new meaning. They were no longer symbols of active warfare, but markers of a new beginning. Under those stars and stripes, German civilians began the long process of rebuilding not just their cities and their economy, but their understanding of what was possible in the modern world. The speechlessness that German women experienced when they first saw American flags flying over their homes was not just the silence of defeat. It was the silence of transformation, the pause that comes when familiar assumptions crumble and new possibilities emerge. In that silence, they heard the sound of abundance, not the abundance of conquest, but the abundance of a nation confident enough to be generous, wealthy enough to share its prosperity, and secure enough in its own identity to plant its flag with pride rather than arrogance. The chocolate bar passed hand to hand from American soldier to German child, carried more than sweetness. It carried the promise that scarcity was not inevitable, that sweetness was not rationed by fate, that the future might hold possibilities too abundant to ration or hoard. Under the American flag, German women began to taste not just chocolate, but hope itself, the revolutionary idea that abundance might be the natural state of human society when freedom and democracy create the conditions for prosperity to flourish. In the end, the American flag flying over German homes represented something more powerful than military conquest. It represented the quiet victory of abundance over scarcity, of generosity over hoarding, of optimism over despair. The German women who stood speechless beneath those stars and stripes were witnessing not just the end of the Third Reich, but the beginning of their own transformation from subjects of a totalitarian state to potential citizens of a world where abundance and freedom were not contradictions, but complements in the grand symphony of human possibility.